The woman stumbled into Wood River, Nebraska, on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878. Her clothes torn and dusty, blood caked on her temple, speaking words that sounded like water rushing over stones but meant nothing to anyone who heard them. Vincent Xavier had been loading supplies onto his wagon outside Henderson's general store when he first saw her collapse against the hitching post, her dark eyes wild with terror, her lips forming urgent sounds in a language that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the dusty streets and wooden storefronts of this cattle town on the edge of the Nebraska prairie. He dropped the sack of flour he'd been carrying and rushed toward her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The woman shrank back when she saw him approaching, raising her hands defensively, her voice rising in pitch as she spoke faster, the strange syllables tumbling over each other. Vincent slowed his approach, raising his own hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy there," he said softly, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't seem to understand his words, but something in his voice or his posture must have reassured her slightly because she stopped trying to back away. Up close, Vincent could see she was young, probably no more than 20 or so, with long dark hair that had come loose from whatever style she'd worn it in. Her dress was made of fabric he didn't recognize, with patterns that definitely weren't from any dry goods store in Nebraska. Her skin was darker than his own sun-weathered tan, and her features suggested origins he couldn't quite place. What in blazes is going on here? Tom Henderson emerged from his store, wiping his hands on his apron. Several other townspeople had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. "Found her like this," Vincent said, still keeping his voice low and steady. "She's hurt and scared, and she doesn't speak English. Probably one of them foreigners from the railroad camps," Mrs. Whitley said from behind her parasol. "They bring in all sorts from overseas to work the lines." The woman's eyes darted from face to face, and she spoke again, this time directing her words at Vincent. She pointed urgently down the main street, then clutched at her own arms, making gestures that could have meant anything. Her expression was desperate, pleading. "She's trying to tell us something," Vincent said. He pointed at her, then at himself, trying to establish some kind of communication. "I'm Vincent," he said, tapping his chest. "Vincent?" She watched him carefully, her breathing still rapid. She touched her own chest and said something that sounded like Vivienne, but with different vowel sounds, more musical. "Vivienne," Vincent repeated, and she nodded quickly, relief flooding her face at this small connection. "Well, that's something at least," Henderson said. "But what are we supposed to do with her? Can't have her wandering around town causing a scene." "She's hurt," Vincent said firmly. "First thing is to get her to Doc Morrison's." He gestured to Vivienne, pointing down the street toward the doctor's office, then miming bandaging a wound. She seemed to understand because she nodded, though her eyes remained wary. Vincent offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and he could feel her trembling. The walk to Doc Morrison's office took only a few minutes, but Vincent was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Wood River wasn't a large town, and strangers were always noticed, especially ones as unusual as Vivienne. She kept close to his side, occasionally speaking in her unknown language, her tone questioning. Doc Morrison was a practical man in his 50s who'd seen just about everything during his years on the frontier. He took one look at Vivienne and ushered them both inside. "Set her down in the examination room," he said. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Getting Vivienne to sit on the examination table proved challenging. She clearly didn't trust the doctor, and when he approached with his medical bag, she pressed herself against the wall, speaking rapidly in her language. Vincent stepped between them. "Let me try something," he said. He sat down on the table himself, then gestured for the doctor to examine his arm. Morrison caught on quickly and made a show of checking Vincent's pulse, looking in his eyes, demonstrating that his intentions were medical. Vivienne watched closely, and when Vincent stood and gestured for her to take his place, she did so, though her entire body remained tense. Morrison worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound on her temple and checking for other injuries. He found bruises on her arms and a twisted ankle. "She's been through something," he said quietly to Vincent. "These bruises look like finger marks. Someone grabbed her hard." Vincent felt a flash of anger at the thought of someone hurting this frightened woman. "Can you help her?" "Physically, yes. The head wound is superficial and the ankle just needs rest, but I can't tell you what happened to her or where she came from." Morrison bandaged her temple and wrapped her ankle. "She needs somewhere to stay and someone to look after her until we can figure out what to do." Vincent knew what he had to do before Morrison even finished speaking. "She can stay at my place. I've got the room and it's quiet out there." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Folks will talk." "Let them talk," Vincent said. He ran a cattle ranch 5 miles outside of town, a spread he'd built up over the past 8 years since settling in Nebraska. His house had 3 bedrooms, and he lived alone except for his ranch hand, Charlie, who slept in the bunkhouse. It wasn't proper by town standards for an unmarried woman to stay at his ranch, but Vincent had never cared much what the town gossips thought, and besides, he couldn't just leave Vivienne with nowhere to go. When he explained his plan to Vivienne through gestures, pointing at himself, then at her, then miming a house and a bed, she seemed to understand. She looked at him for a long moment, those dark eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded. The ride out to the ranch was quiet except for the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Vivienne sat beside Vincent on the bench seat, her bandaged head tilted slightly as she took in the vast expanse of prairie stretching out on either side of the rutted road. Once, she pointed at the horizon and spoke, her tone wondering, and Vincent wished desperately that he could understand what she was saying. The Xavier ranch came into view as they crested a low hill. The house was a solid 2-story structure Vincent had built himself with help from Charlie and some hired hands. The barn stood nearby, weathered but sturdy, and several horses grazed in the corral. Beyond that lay rolling grassland where his cattle roamed. Charlie emerged from the barn as Vincent pulled the wagon up to the house. He was a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes widened when he saw Vivienne. "Boss, you want to explain what's going on?" Vincent did his best, explaining how he'd found Vivienne and her condition. Charlie listened, his expression growing more serious. "You think someone was chasing her?" "I don't know, but those bruises didn't come from nowhere." Vincent helped Vivienne down from the wagon, noting how she winced when she put weight on her injured ankle. Without thinking too hard about it, he swept her up into his arms. She stiffened in surprise, speaking quickly, but he just carried her toward the house. "We'll keep watch tonight, just in case." Inside, Vincent set Vivienne down on the sofa in the parlor. The house was neat but clearly a bachelor's residence, with practical furniture and few decorative touches. Vivienne looked around, taking in her surroundings, and said something that might have been a question. "You're safe here," Vincent said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping his tone would convey the meaning. "I promise you're safe." He showed her to the guest bedroom upstairs, which had a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Vivienne sat carefully on the edge of the bed, testing its firmness, then looked up at him and spoke. This time her tone was clearly grateful. "You're welcome," Vincent said. He brought her water and some bread and cheese, which she accepted gratefully. She ate slowly, as if she hadn't had food in some time. Vincent watched from the doorway, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? What had happened to her? And most pressingly, how could he help her when they couldn't even communicate? That night, Vincent barely slept. He kept his rifle close and listened for any sounds that might indicate trouble. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps on the stairs and tensed, but it was only Vivienne. She appeared in the doorway of the parlor where he'd been dozing in a chair, and when she saw he was awake, she spoke softly. He couldn't understand her words, but he could read the fear in her eyes. "Bad dream?" he asked gently. She wrapped her arms around herself and continued speaking, her voice breaking at times. Vincent stood and guided her back to the sofa, gesturing for her to sit. He went to the kitchen and heated some milk on the stove, then brought it to her. His mother had always given him warm milk when he was a boy and couldn't sleep. Vivienne accepted the cup and sipped it, her hands wrapped around the warmth. She looked at Vincent and spoke again, this time more slowly, as if trying to make him understand through sheer force of will. She pointed out the window toward the east, then made a gesture that looked like mountains, then touched her chest again and said her name. "You're from the mountains," Vincent guessed. "Somewhere east of here." She seemed frustrated that he didn't understand and tried again, this time adding more gestures. She pretended to be riding something, maybe a horse or a wagon, then showed movement across distance, then pointed to herself and made a breaking motion with her hands, like something being torn apart. "Someone took you," Vincent said, understanding dawning. "You were traveling and someone grabbed you, brought you here against your will." The relief on Vivienne's face when he seemed to grasp the general idea was palpable. She nodded vigorously and continued her story through gestures. She showed running, hiding, escaping. She pointed at her bruises and made a violent grabbing motion. Then she pointed at Wood River's direction and acted out her collapse. Vincent felt his jaw tighten. "Whoever took you, they're still out there. They might come looking for you." Over the following days, Vincent and Vivienne developed a rough system of communication through gestures, simple drawings, and repetition. He would point at objects and say their English names, and she would repeat them in her language. The sounds she made were unlike anything he'd heard before, full of soft consonants and flowing vowels that seemed to roll off her tongue like music. She taught him how to say water in her language, which sounded like Shia. He taught her the English word. She drew pictures in the dust of the yard showing him her home, which appeared to be a village of some kind with unusual architecture, nothing like the log cabins or frame houses of Nebraska. When he brought her a map, trying to help her show him where she was from, she studied it for a long time, her brow furrowed, then pointed to a region far to the southwest. "That's a long way from here," Vincent said. "How did you end up in Nebraska?" She couldn't explain in words he understood, but through more drawings and gestures, she conveyed a story of being taken from her home, transported across great distances against her will. The bruises on her arms were fading from purple to yellow-green, but they remained a stark reminder of what she'd endured. Vincent found himself thinking about her constantly, even when he was out checking on the cattle or mending fences. There was something about her strength and resilience that drew him in. Despite everything she'd been through, despite being in a strange place where no one understood her language, she maintained a quiet dignity. She helped around the house without being asked, learning quickly where things were kept and how tasks were done. She had a beautiful smile that she shared more frequently as the days passed, and she began to feel safer. 2 weeks after Vivienne's arrival, Vincent rode into Wood River for supplies and to check if anyone had reported a missing woman or if strangers had been asking questions. At Henderson's store, he ran into Sheriff Dawson, a solid man in his early 50s with a thick mustache and a no-nonsense attitude. "Xavier," Dawson greeted him. "How's that foreign girl doing?" "She's recovering," Vincent said. "Her ankle's nearly healed. Anyone come asking about her?" "No, and that worries me. Someone grabbed her and brought her here for a reason. I don't think they've given up looking." Dawson nodded slowly. "I've been asking around. About a month ago, some men passed through town, rough types, said they were transporting workers to the railroad camps further west. Could be related." Vincent's gut told him it was absolutely related. "If anyone comes asking about a woman matching her description, I want to know immediately." "You getting attached to her, Xavier?" Dawson asked, not unkindly. Vincent didn't answer right away. Was he getting attached? He'd never been the type to form quick connections with people. He was a loner by nature, content with his ranch and his animals and the occasional trip to town for supplies. But Vivienne was different. Despite the language barrier, he felt like he understood her on some fundamental level. The way she looked at the prairie at sunset, the gentle way she handled the horses, the fierce independence he saw in her eyes even when she was afraid, all of it spoke to something deep inside him. "I just want to make sure she's safe," he said finally. Back at the ranch, Vincent found Vivienne in the kitchen garden Charlie had helped him plant years ago but which he'd mostly neglected. She'd somehow managed to identify which plants were weeds and which were vegetables, and she was carefully tending to the struggling tomato plants. She looked up when she heard his horse and waved, calling out something in her language that sounded like a greeting. That evening, Vincent made a decision. If he and Vivienne were going to live under the same roof for however long it took to figure out what to do next, they needed to be able to communicate better. He brought paper and pencils to the kitchen table after dinner and gestured for her to sit with him. He started with simple words, drawing pictures and writing the English words beside them. House, horse, water, sun, moon. Vivienne was a quick study, repeating the words and correcting his pronunciation when he attempted hers. She drew pictures too, teaching him words from her language. He learned that her people had a word for love that was also the same word for breath, as if love was as essential as air. "Naru," she said, tapping the picture she'd drawn of two people with their hands clasped. "Naru." "Love," Vincent said, writing the English word. "Or maybe to care for someone." She repeated love carefully, her accent making it sound softer, rounder. Then she pointed at him and said something in her language, a sentence with the word for care in it. "I don't understand," Vincent said, though his heart had started beating faster. She tried again, this time just pointing at him and saying Naru, then pointing at herself and saying it again, then bringing her hands together. The meaning was clear even without shared language. She was saying that he cared for her, and she was grateful. "Yes," Vincent said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes, I care that you're safe." The weeks turned into a month, then two. Vincent and Vivienne's ability to communicate improved gradually. She learned English words quickly, picking up nouns and simple verbs, while he struggled more with her language, which had grammatical structures completely foreign to anything he'd encountered. But they managed. They told each other stories in broken sentences and gestures, filling in the gaps with intuition. Vivienne told him about her home, a place she called by a name he couldn't quite pronounce correctly, no matter how many times she repeated it. It was a valley between mountains, she explained, where her people had lived for generations. They grew crops he'd never heard of and raised animals that sounded like nothing in Nebraska. Her father had been a craftsman, creating beautiful objects from metal and stone. Her mother had taught her about plants and healing. Vincent told her about his own life, growing up in Missouri, learning ranching from his father, heading west after both his parents died in a cholera outbreak. He told her about building this ranch from nothing, about the hard winters and the dry summers, about the satisfaction of watching his herd grow year by year. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and orange, Vivienne spoke in careful English. "Why you help me, Vincent?" He considered the question. "Because it was the right thing to do. You needed help. Many people see, only you help." That was true. Others had seen her collapse in town, but he'd been the one to step forward. "I couldn't just walk away," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then said something in her own language that he'd learned meant, "Good man." She reached over and placed her hand on his, a simple gesture that sent warmth spreading through his chest. Vincent looked at their hands, hers smaller and darker against his weathered, calloused palm. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have this kind of connection with another person. It terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. "Vivienne," he started, then stopped, not sure what he wanted to say or how to say it in a way she'd fully understand. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the sunset colors. "Yes, I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "I'm glad you're safe." She smiled and in her careful English said, "I am glad too." The peaceful weeks came to an abrupt end on a hot afternoon in late September. Vincent was working in the barn when Charlie came running from the north pasture, his face tight with alarm. "Boss, we've got riders coming in fast." "4 of them, and they don't look friendly." Vincent's blood ran cold. "Get Vivienne and take her to the root cellar. Now." He grabbed his rifle from where it hung just inside the barn door and positioned himself where he could see the approaching riders. They came into view moments later, 4 men on horseback pushing their mounts hard. Even from a distance, Vincent could see they were the rough types Sheriff Dawson had mentioned, men who looked like they made their living outside the law. The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses blowing hard. The leader was a big man with a scar running down one cheek and cold eyes that surveyed the ranch with predatory interest. "Help you gentlemen," Vincent called out, keeping his rifle visible but not directly aimed. "Looking for something that belongs to us," the scarred man said. His voice had a rough edge like boots on gravel. "Foreign girl, dark hair, dark skin. Word in town is you've got her here." "Don't know what you're talking about," Vincent said evenly. The man's expression didn't change. "Now, that's interesting, because several folks in Wood River told us Xavier brought her out to his ranch, said he was looking after her." He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "We paid good money for that girl, and we mean to get her back." Vincent felt rage building in his chest. "Paid money? She's a person, not property." "She's cargo," the man said flatly. "We transport workers to where they're needed. Sometimes they try to run. That's bad for business." He took a step closer. "Now, you can hand her over peaceful-like, or we can do this the hard way." "There's 4 of you and 1 of me," Vincent said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "That's true. But I guarantee I'll get at least 2 of you before you get me, and your boss isn't paying you enough to die for this. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on your horses and ride out of here, and you're going to forget you ever heard of this ranch." The scarred man studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Then he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're making a mistake, Xavier, but we've got time. We'll be back." The 4 men mounted up and rode out, but slowly, making it clear they weren't afraid. Vincent kept his rifle ready until they disappeared over the rise, then let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Charlie emerged from the house with Vivienne, who looked pale but composed. She'd clearly understood enough of the confrontation to know she'd been the subject of it. She spoke rapidly in her language, then switched to broken English. "They come for me. I go. You not in danger." "No," Vincent said firmly. "You're not going anywhere with those men. They hurt you, kill you." There were tears in her eyes now. "I not want that." Vincent set down his rifle and took her hands in his. "Vivienne, listen to me. I'm not letting them take you. Do you understand? You're safe here." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and something else, something deeper. "Safe," she repeated. It was one of the first English words he'd taught her, and he'd repeated it so often that she knew it well. "You say I'm safe?" "Yes," Vincent said. "You're safe. I promise you're safe." She stepped closer to him, and for a moment they just stood there, hands clasped, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. Then Charlie cleared his throat. "Boss, those men will be back, and they'll bring more with them next time. We need a plan." Vincent knew Charlie was right. He also knew he couldn't handle this alone. "I'm riding to town to get Sheriff Dawson. Charlie, you stay here with Vivienne. Keep the rifle close and don't open the door for anyone but me." The ride to Wood River seemed to take forever, though Vincent pushed his horse as fast as he dared. His mind raced with possibilities, all of them bad. Those men wouldn't give up easily, and they had the advantage of numbers. Even with the sheriff's help, this could turn into a bloodbath. Sheriff Dawson listened to Vincent's story with growing anger. "Human trafficking," he said, spitting the words like they tasted foul. "It's getting more common, particularly with immigrants and people from remote areas. They promise good jobs, then essentially enslave them. What can we do?" "Legally, not much, unless we can prove she was taken against her will and transported across state lines. But practically," Dawson stood and reached for his gun belt. "Practically, I can make sure those men know they're not welcome in my county, and that anyone who tries to take that girl by force will answer to the law." Dawson rounded up 2 deputies, and the 4 men rode back to the Xavier ranch as the sun was setting. Vincent felt marginally better with the law on his side, but he knew this wasn't over. When they arrived at the ranch, Charlie met them at the door, his face grim. "They came back about an hour after you left, boss. 6 of them this time. They didn't try anything, just sat on that ridge over there." He pointed to a low rise about a quarter-mile from the house, watching. "They're still there." Vincent looked where Charlie indicated and saw the silhouettes of men and horses against the darkening sky. "They're waiting us out." "Not for long," Dawson said. He mounted back up and rode toward the ridge, his deputies following. Vincent grabbed his rifle and went with them, leaving Charlie to guard the house and Vivienne. As they approached, the 6 men made no move to leave. The scarred man from earlier sat his horse in the center, and now Vincent could see another man beside him, older, with gray in his beard and the look of someone used to being in charge. "Sheriff," the older man greeted them. "Bit late in the day for a ride, isn't it?" "Could say the same to you," Dawson replied. "You're on private property and you're making the owner nervous. Time to move along. We have business here." "Not anymore, you don't. The woman you're looking for is under my protection now. She's made it clear she doesn't want to go with you, which means if you try to take her, it's kidnapping, and I will arrest every last one of you." The older man's expression hardened. "You don't know what you're interfering with, Sheriff. We have contracts, legitimate business agreements. Show me a contract signed by that woman, and we'll talk. Until then, you need to clear out of this county by sunrise, or I'll be bringing in a federal marshal to have a conversation with you about human trafficking." There was a long, tense silence. Vincent kept his rifle ready, very aware that they were outnumbered. If this turned into a fight, people would die. Finally, the older man nodded slowly. "We'll go, but this isn't finished." "Yes, it is," Dawson said firmly. "If I see any of you in Wood River or on Xavier's land again, I'll arrest you on sight. That's a promise." The men turned their horses and rode off into the gathering darkness. Dawson watched them go, then turned to Vincent. "They'll probably move on to easier targets, but keep your guard up for a while. Men like that don't like being thwarted." Back at the house, Vincent found Vivienne in the kitchen, pacing anxiously. When she saw him, she rushed over, speaking rapidly in her language, then switching to English. "Okay, you okay?" "I'm fine," Vincent assured her. "They're gone. The sheriff told them to leave the county." The relief on her face was overwhelming. She closed her eyes and said something in her language that sounded like a prayer or blessing. When she opened them again, there were tears on her cheeks. "Hey," Vincent said softly. He reached up and gently wiped the tears away with his thumb. "It's over. You're safe now." She caught his hand and held it against her cheek. "You risk much for me. Why?" Vincent looked into her eyes and knew the time for pretending had passed. "Because somewhere along the way, I stopped just wanting to keep you safe and started caring about you as more than just someone who needed help." Even with the language barrier, his meaning was clear. Vivienne's breath caught and she said something in her language, soft and musical. Then, in English, "I feel same. For you, my heart, it speaks your name." Vincent pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, and Vincent felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He felt complete. Over the following months, as autumn turned to winter, Vincent and Vivienne's relationship deepened. Her English improved dramatically, though she still struggled with some of the more complex grammatical structures, and he learned enough of her language to manage basic conversations. He learned that "you're safe" in her tongue was Shanu Ramara, and he said it to her often, wanting her to never doubt that she was protected and cherished. She told him the full story of what had happened to her, now that she had the English words to explain. She'd been traveling with a merchant caravan from her homeland, hoping to reach a port city where she could find work. The men who eventually brought her to Nebraska had attacked the caravan, killed or scattered her companions, and taken her along with several others. They'd been transported across vast distances, kept drugged much of the time, destined for some kind of labor camp or worse. She'd managed to escape when they'd stopped briefly in a town somewhere in Kansas, slipping away during the confusion when one of their wagons broke down. She'd been running and hiding for days before collapsing in Wood River, half dead from exhaustion and dehydration. "I thought I'd die," she told Vincent one evening as they sat by the fire. "I pray to my gods, I say if I must die, let it be free. Then I see your face." Vincent pulled her closer. "I'm glad I was there. You teach me safe," she continued. "First English word I truly understand, because you say it with your eyes, with your hands, with everything, not just word, promise." "It is a promise," Vincent said. "You're safe with me, Vivienne, always." She turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and sweet. It wasn't their first kiss, but each one still felt new and miraculous. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. "I love you," she said carefully in English. "I am say this right." "You're saying it perfectly," Vincent replied. "And I love you too. In English, in your language, in any way we can say it." As winter settled over Nebraska, bringing snow and cold winds that howled across the prairie, Vincent and Vivienne created a warm life together inside the ranch house. She continued to learn about his world, mastering the routines of the ranch, helping with the animals, and developing a reputation in town as a skilled gardener and healer. She used knowledge from her homeland to create remedies that actually worked, and soon people were coming out to the ranch specifically to see her. Vincent, meanwhile, continued learning her language and her culture. She taught him songs from her homeland, taught him about her people's beliefs and traditions. He learned that in her culture, marriage was formalized through a ceremony where the couple exchanged promises while standing in running water, symbolizing the flow of life they would navigate together. "We not have running water now," Vivienne said with a laugh one snowy January afternoon. "But in spring, yes." Vincent's heart leaped. "Are you asking me to marry you?" She looked suddenly uncertain. "In your culture, man must ask woman." "Usually, but I don't care about usual." Vincent got down on one knee right there in the kitchen. "Vivienne, will you marry me? In the spring, in running water, or tomorrow in a church, or both, or however you want. Just say you'll be my wife." Her smile could have lit up the whole prairie. "Yes, yes, I marry you, Vincent Xavier." "I be Vivienne Xavier." "If you want to be," Vincent said, standing and pulling her into his arms. "Though Vivienne Farrington is beautiful too." He'd learned her last name, or at least the closest English approximation of it, months ago. "Vivienne Farrington Xavier," she said, testing out the full name. "Yes, this is good. This is right." They were married twice. First, in early May when the snow had melted and Wood River Creek ran high with spring runoff, they performed her people's ceremony. Vincent had studied the words for weeks, wanting to say his vows in her language. They stood barefoot in the cold water, hands clasped, and promised to be each other's shelter, each other's breath, each other's home. Then, a week later, they were married again in the small church in Wood River, with Sheriff Dawson standing up as Vincent's best man and Mrs. Henderson as Vivienne's matron of honor. The church was packed with townspeople who'd come to appreciate the mysterious foreign woman who'd become one of their own. Vivienne wore a dress that was a blend of styles, something Mrs. Henderson had helped her create that incorporated elements from both her homeland and American fashion. When the preacher asked Vincent to say his vows, he spoke them first in English, then repeated them in Vivienne's language. He saw tears in her eyes when he said, "Shanu Ramara," you're safe, incorporating it into his promise to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. At the reception afterward, held in Henderson's store which had been cleared of merchandise for the occasion, Charlie raised a glass in toast. "To the boss and his bride," he said. "I've known Vincent Xavier for 10 years, and I've never seen him as happy as he's been these past months. Vivienne, you've made this old ranch into a real home." The first year of their marriage was full of joy and discovery. Vivienne became pregnant by late summer, and Vincent was simultaneously terrified and elated. Doc Morrison assured them both that Vivienne was healthy and the pregnancy was progressing normally. "I hope baby have your eyes," Vivienne said one evening, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Blue like sky." "I hope the baby has your strength," Vincent replied, "and your courage." Their son was born on a cold March morning in 1880, arriving quickly and loudly, announcing his presence with a powerful cry. Vincent held him for the first time and felt his eyes burn with tears. The baby had dark hair like his mother and eyes that would eventually turn the same color as Vincent's. "What name?" Vivienne asked, exhausted but glowing. They discussed names for months, trying to find something that honored both their heritages. "What about Daniel?" Vincent suggested. "It means God is my judge in English. Does it translate to something in your language?" Vivienne considered, then smiled. "Similar, we have Damiel, mean truth keeper, is close." "Daniel Damiel Xavier," Vincent said, testing it out. "Hello, Daniel, welcome home." Little Daniel was followed by a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Margaret after Vincent's mother, with Vivienne's mother's name, which Vincent approximated as Larina, as her middle name. Then came another son and twin girls, until the Xavier house was full of laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of family life. Vivienne never forgot her homeland, but Nebraska became home in a way she'd never expected. She taught their children both languages, both sets of traditions. She maintained the garden that had become famous throughout the county, growing vegetables and medicinal herbs that she shared generously with neighbors. She became a respected member of the community, known for her kindness and her healing skills. Vincent expanded the ranch over the years, prospering through a combination of hard work and good fortune. But the true wealth, he always said, was his family. Every night after the children were in bed, he and Vivienne would sit on the porch and watch the sunset over the prairie, just as they'd done that first summer. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked one evening, many years into their marriage. Their oldest, Daniel, was preparing to take over more of the ranch operations, and they just welcomed their first grandchild. "Staying here, I mean. Being so far from where you came from." Vivienne took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his the way they had 1,000 times before. "I tell you story," she said. Her English was fluent now, though she still carried an accent that Vincent found beautiful. "In my homeland we have saying, home is not ground beneath feet. Home is heart that sees you. You see me, Vincent. From first moment when I have no words, when I am afraid and lost, you see me. You make me safe. How I regret finding home." Vincent lifted her hand to his lips. "I love you, and I love you," she replied. "In English, in my language, in the language we make together. Always." As the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Vincent thought about that day so many years ago when a frightened woman who spoke a language no one understood had stumbled into his life. He thought about how he'd learned enough of that language to tell her she was safe, and how that simple promise had grown into a lifetime of love. The ranch dogs barked in the distance, and he could hear his grandchildren playing in the yard. Vivienne leaned her head on his shoulder, and Vincent wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They'd built something beautiful together, something that transcended language and culture and all the differences that might have kept them apart. On the horizon, a new moon was rising, silver against the deepening blue. Vincent remembered Vivienne teaching him the word for moon in her language, one of the first lessons in their long journey of learning to truly communicate. He said it now, softly, and she smiled. "You remember," she said. "I remember everything," Vincent replied. And he did. He remembered every moment of their story, from that first frightening day to this peaceful evening surrounded by family. He remembered the fear in her eyes when she couldn't make anyone understand, and the relief when he'd promised her safety. He remembered falling in love despite the language barrier, or perhaps because of it, learning to communicate in ways that went deeper than words. Most of all, he remembered that love didn't require a shared language. It required a shared heart, a willingness to see and be seen, to protect and be protected, to make a home together no matter how different the paths that led you there. Years later, when Vincent was an old man and his children and grandchildren gathered around him, they would ask him to tell the story again of how he met their grandmother. And he would tell them about the day a woman who spoke a language no one understood stumbled into Wood River, and how a cowboy learned enough to say the only words that really mattered. "She was afraid and hurt and alone," Vincent would say, Vivienne sitting beside him, their hands still clasped after all those years. "And I wanted her to know she didn't have to be afraid anymore, so I learned to say you're safe in her language. But the truth is, she taught me what those words really meant. She taught me about courage and strength and trust. She taught me that home isn't a place, it's a person." Vivienne would always add the ending, her accent still present even after decades in Nebraska. "And he teach me that sometimes the person who save you is the person you were meant to find all along." That being lost is how we discover where we truly belong. The Xavier Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations. Daniel and his siblings made sure their children knew both languages their grandmother had spoken, keeping alive the traditions from a distant homeland while embracing their Nebraska roots. The story of how Vincent and Vivienne met became family legend, told and retold, a reminder that love could bridge any divide. In the end, when Vincent and Vivienne were laid to rest side by side in the cemetery overlooking Wood River, their headstone bore an inscription in 2 languages. In English, it read, "Together they built a home." In Vivienne's language, Vincent's careful translation of what became their family motto, "Love is the language we all understand." The town of Wood River grew and changed over the decades, but the Xavier Ranch remained, a testament to what could be built when 2 people from different worlds chose to make a life together. The prairie wind still blew across the grasslands, carrying with it whispers of the past, stories of courage and kindness, and a love that transcended language. And somewhere in those whispers, if you listened carefully enough, you could hear Vincent's voice saying, "Shanu Ramara," "You're safe," and Vivienne's reply, "Naru," "Love," the words that had bridged the gap between 2 hearts and created something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. Vincent Xavier had been a simple rancher, a man who'd built his life through hard work and determination. But the day he chose to help a frightened woman who spoke a language no one understood, he'd become something more. He'd become a bridge between worlds, a protector, a partner in the truest sense. He'd learned that communication wasn't just about words, it was about presence and consistency, and showing up day after day to prove that your promises meant something. Vivienne Farrington had been lost, stolen from everything she knew, thrust into a world where she couldn't make herself understood. But she'd survived through pure force of will, and when she'd finally found safety in the form of a Nebraska cowboy with kind eyes and gentle hands, she'd chosen to build rather than retreat. She'd learned a new language, adapted to a new culture, but never lost the essence of who she was. She'd taught everyone around her that strength came in many forms, and that home could be built anywhere if you had the right foundation. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both worlds, embodied living proof that differences enriched rather than divided. They spread across Nebraska and beyond, carrying with them the lessons their parents had taught about love, acceptance, and the courage to bridge divides. The garden Vivienne had planted behind the ranch house continued to bloom year after year, tended by her daughters and granddaughters. The medicinal herbs she'd introduced became staples in the region, and her remedies were written down and shared, a legacy of healing that extended far beyond her lifetime. The ranch itself became known as a place of welcome, somewhere people of all backgrounds knew they would be treated fairly and with respect. Vincent and Vivienne's example had set a standard that their descendants maintained, creating a space where the lost and frightened could find refuge, just as Vivienne had all those years ago. On summer evenings, when the grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered on that same porch where Vincent and Vivienne had spent so many hours, they would look out over the prairie and feel connected to something larger than themselves. They were part of a story that transcended time and place, a story about choosing love over fear, understanding over ignorance, connection over isolation. The town of Wood River eventually erected a small monument in the square, honoring Vincent Xavier for her contributions to the community. It noted her skill as a healer, her work in creating community gardens, her role in teaching others about agriculture techniques from her homeland that proved valuable in the challenging Nebraska climate. But for those who'd known her, the real monument was the lives she'd touched, the people she'd helped, the love she'd shared. Vincent's legacy was equally profound. He was remembered as a fair employer, a skilled rancher, and a man of his word. But more than that, he was remembered as someone who'd seen a person in need and hadn't looked away. In a time and place where it would have been easy to ignore Vivienne's plight, he'd chosen to act. That choice had rippled outward, affecting everyone who knew him. Their love story became a touchstone for the community, proof that what seemed like insurmountable obstacles could be overcome with patience, determination, and genuine care. Couples facing their own challenges would think of Vincent and Vivienne and find hope. If a cowboy and a woman who spoke different languages could build a life together, surely others could bridge their own divides. As the seasons turned and the years rolled on, the prairie remained constant, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving and generous all at once. It was the same prairie Vincent had shown Vivienne all those years ago, the same land that had witnessed their courtship and their marriage and the building of their family. The grass grew and was cut and grew again. The wind blew and the rain fell and the sun beat down, and through it all, the Xavier Ranch endured. On the anniversary of Vivienne's arrival in Wood River, the family would gather, now numbering in the dozens. They would share the traditional meal Vivienne had taught them to prepare, with dishes from her homeland alongside Nebraska beef and vegetables from the garden. They would tell stories in both languages, keeping alive the linguistic heritage that made them unique. And they would raise their glasses in a toast that Vincent had established decades before. To love that crosses all borders, someone would say in English. To promises kept, another would add in Vivienne's language. To home, wherever we make it, a third would contribute. And finally, someone would always end with the words that had started it all, the promise that had changed two lives and created a legacy. You're safe. The response would come in chorus in both languages from all the assembled family. Always safe, always home, always loved. This was the gift Vincent and Vivienne had given their descendants. Not wealth, though the ranch was prosperous. Not fame, though their story was known throughout the region. The real gift was the knowledge that love was the universal language, that safety was a promise worth keeping, and that home could be built anywhere two hearts decided to make it. Vincent Xavier had been 26 years old when Vivienne stumbled into his life. He thought his path was set, his future a solo journey of building a ranch and maybe, someday, finding a woman to share it with. He'd never imagined that future would arrive in the form of a terrified woman who couldn't tell him her name, much less her story. Vivienne Farrington had been 22 when she collapsed in Wood River, certain she was going to die far from everything she knew. She'd never imagined she would not only survive but thrive, finding love and building a family in a place she'd never heard of before that desperate day. Neither of them could have predicted the life they would build together, but both of them made the choice, day after day, to keep building it. Vincent chose to keep learning Vivienne's language even when it was difficult. Vivienne chose to embrace Nebraska even when she missed her homeland. Together, they chose to create something new, something that honored both their pasts while forging a shared future. In the end, that was what made their story extraordinary. Not the dramatic rescue or the dangerous men or even the language barrier they overcame. What made it extraordinary was the daily choice to love each other, to protect each other, to create a home together. It was the small moments that added up to a lifetime. The gentle touch of a hand, the soft words spoken in the evening, the laughter shared over dinner, the tears shed in times of sorrow and wiped away by a partner who understood. When the last of the evening light faded from the Nebraska sky, and the stars came out in their thousands, the Xavier Ranch would settle into peaceful silence. The cattle would bed down in the pastures. The horses would drowse in their stalls. And inside the house, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, love well shared, and promises faithfully kept, the spirit of what Vincent and Vivienne had created would endure. Their story was one of hope and courage, and the transformative power of compassion. It was proof that language barriers could be overcome, that cultural differences could be bridged, that love could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances. It was a testament to the idea that sometimes the most important thing you could say to another person was, "You're safe," and mean it with every fiber of your being. Vincent Xavier learned enough of a language no one else understood to tell Vivienne Farrington she was safe. And in doing so, he created a safety that extended far beyond physical protection. He created emotional safety, the kind that allowed her to heal from her trauma and open her heart to love. He created a safe home where children could grow and thrive. He created a safe legacy that would ripple forward through generations, touching lives that hadn't even been conceived yet on that hot July day in 1878. And Vivienne, in turn, had given Vincent something he hadn't even known he was missing. She'd given him purpose and partnership, and a love that was deeper and truer than anything he'd imagined possible. She'd expanded his world, teaching him new ways of seeing and being. She'd made him a better man, not by changing who he was, but by giving him someone worth being better for. Together, they'd proven that home wasn't about where you came from. It was about who you chose to be with, who you built a life alongside, who you trusted enough to be vulnerable with. Home was the sound of a voice speaking words you'd learned just for them. Home was the feeling of a hand in yours as you watched the sunset. Home was knowing that no matter what came, you'd face it together. As the prairie night deepened and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, the story of Vincent and Vivienne rested in the hearts of all who knew it. It lived in the words they'd taught each other, the traditions they'd blended, the family they'd created, and the love they'd shared. It lived in every promise kept, every kindness shown, every choice to see another person's humanity rather than their differences. The woman had spoken a language no one understood. The cowboy had learned enough to say, "You're safe." And from those simple beginnings, they'd built a love story for the ages, one that would continue to inspire long after the prairie winds had weathered their headstone and the ranch had passed to distant descendants. Their legacy wasn't written in stone or recorded in history books. It was written in the hearts of everyone who chose to believe that love could overcome any obstacle, that understanding was always possible, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was offer safety to someone who desperately needed it. This was the story of Vincent Xavier and Vivienne Farrington Xavier. This was the story of a promise kept, a language learned, and a love that transcended every boundary. This was the story of home, found in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, in the most unexpected way. And it was a story that, once told, would never truly end, because the love it spoke of was eternal, echoing across time like a voice calling across the prairie, saying in every language that mattered, "You're safe. You're loved. You're home."